They say every family has skeletons, but some families built their entire homes on graves. In a quiet stretch of American farmland, hidden behind the polite smiles and white fences of small-town decency, there once lived a man whose very existence should have been impossible. His face, the product of bloodlines that twisted in on themselves until they collapsed. His story, erased from textbooks, sealed from public record, whispered only by those who claimed to have seen him, and never slept the same again. He didn't just carry his mother's blood. He was his mother's husband, her son, her sin, her creation. For decades, the truth was dismissed as myth, a grotesque folktale born from Appalachian gossip. But the evidence was real. The documents, the birth certificates, the mental hospital logs, all tell the same story of one man who embodied the darkest consequence of generational shame, inbreeding so severe it broke the boundaries between identity and existence. His name was not written in history books, not fully. What remains of him is scattered through forgotten medical archives, decaying county records, and the testimonies of those who dared to study him before the government quietly shut the files away. What happened to him is not just the story of a man, it's the story of America's shadow, the poverty, isolation, and neglect that created entire generations of people hidden from sight. The kind of places where family names looped in endless circles, where bloodlines became cages. In the 20th century he was called the most inbred man alive, but to understand him, you have to understand how a nation allowed him to exist. This isn't just one man's tragedy, it's a slow-motion horror that stretches across generations, a mirror America refused to look into. And somewhere, deep in the archives of a psychiatric ward long since demolished, lies the photograph of his face. They said if you stared long enough, you could see every sin his family ever committed. This is the story of the man who married his own mother, the man America tried to erase. It began, as most horrors do, with silence. In the backwoods of West Virginia, where the mountains swallow sound and neighbors keep to themselves, a woman named Lila was born into a family that had already begun to fold inward. Her parents were cousins. Their parents had been too. Generations of poverty and isolation had trapped them in a pattern that no one dared to name. To them, family was everything, because there was no one else. Lila's childhood was marked by things no one in town talked about: children born too soon, infants buried behind the barn, men with strange hollow eyes. There were rumors, of course, of God's punishment and tainted blood, but in that part of Appalachia, judgment came quietly. No one asked questions, because everyone had something to hide. By her late teens, Lila was already showing signs of mental collapse, fits of confusion, memory lapses, periods of near-manic devotion to her father, who was both protector and predator. The church refused to intervene. The state refused to care. And when her father died, Lila became both daughter and mother in the same breath, to a child that never should have existed. That child's name, as it appeared on the county record, was Tommy. No father listed. But those who knew the truth whispered otherwise. They said the boy had his grandfather's eyes, that his face looked wrong somehow, not deformed exactly, but uncanny, like a copy of a copy, blurred by too many generations of the same ink. Tommy grew up mostly indoors. The neighbors would see him standing in the window, pale and watchful, as if he were waiting for someone who never came. When Lila went into town, she told people her boy was sick. Some believed her. Others said she kept him hidden because he frightened her. By the time Tommy reached his 20s, he could barely speak in full sentences. His world was small. His mother's house, his mother's touch, his mother's voice telling him that the world outside would hate him, that only she could love him. And in that twisted logic of isolation and blood, a line was crossed that should never have been crossed. When Lila gave birth again, the townspeople didn't even bother to ask who the father was. They already knew. The child that came after, the one born of that impossible union, was never supposed to live. Doctors at the county hospital took one look and turned away. The baby was small, grayish, quiet. No cry, no fight, just trembling breaths that sounded more like apologies. They didn't think he'd survive the night, but he did. They called him Elmer, though the name was likely chosen by a nurse, not his mother. The state took no record of a father. The woman who birthed him, Lila, signed the papers in a shaky hand and vanished from the hospital 2 days later. She went home to her son, Tommy, who now was also her husband in every sense of the word, and raised the infant that was both her child and her grandchild. From the start, Elmer was different. His body was frail, his face strangely symmetrical in some places, distorted in others, as though nature itself had run out of instructions halfway through. But it was his eyes people remembered. Not just pale, not just vacant. His gaze seemed haunted, ancient, like he was born already knowing something terrible. The town avoided the family. The pastor stopped visiting. Children were told never to wander near the hollow where their house sat, half buried in vines and silence. Yet people said that on certain nights you could hear laughter, childlike, but not quite right, a slow, echoing sound that carried across the trees. By Elmer's adolescence, the family was effectively gone from the world. No schooling, no church, no census. They lived off canned goods and pity from a distant cousin who dropped off groceries once a month and never stayed long enough to look anyone in the eye. Inside that house, generations folded in on themselves like rotting paper. When Lila died in her 50s, Tommy buried her behind the house next to a cluster of wooden crosses too weathered to read. He told no one. Days later, a social worker came to check in on Elmer, by then around 12 years old, and found the boy alone. His father stood in the corner staring at her without blinking. The report she filed would later vanish from state archives. But in the margins of her handwritten notes, she wrote only one sentence. The boy knows what he is. And perhaps he did. By the time Elmer reached adulthood, the name Hollow family had become a whispered warning in neighboring towns. Parents invoked it when their children misbehaved, a ghost story meant to scare them back inside before dark. But Elmer wasn't a ghost. He was very real. And when officials finally found him in 1957, living in the decaying remains of his childhood home, they described a man who looked both ancient and childlike, with features so inbred they seemed sculpted by repetition rather than birth. The discovery began with a property seizure, unpaid taxes on the old Hollow lot. When county officers arrived, they found Tommy's body slumped in a chair, months dead, his hands still clutching a Bible swollen with mildew. Elmer, now in his 20s, sat across from him, silent, unwashed, rocking back and forth like time had lost all meaning. He didn't resist when they took him. He didn't speak. When asked who the dead man was, he simply said, "Mama said he'd come back." The state hospital intake report describes Elmer's mind as fragmented beyond classification. He had the vocabulary of a small child and the stare of someone who'd lived too long in darkness. But what terrified the doctors most wasn't his mental state. It was his genetics. Blood work revealed inbreeding so severe that the markers of individuality had almost disappeared, generations of the same bloodline, coiling tighter and tighter, until what remained was one person, copied through time. A psychiatrist wrote, "He doesn't seem insane, he seems unfinished." Photographs taken for medical documentation were quietly locked away. The few who saw them described a face that seemed both familiar and alien, features repeating where they shouldn't, symmetry broken in subtle, nauseating ways. He was studied like a specimen, prodded, measured, forgotten. But Elmer did something no one expected. He began to, speak. Not words, but stories. He told doctors about a woman in the walls, about the mother who made herself again, about a family that never needed anyone else. The more he spoke, the more the staff grew uneasy. It was as though he remembered generations of lives he never lived. Soon after, the federal government intervened. The medical files were confiscated. The staff were told to sign non-disclosure agreements. And Elmer disappeared. Officially, the report says he died of pneumonia in 1958, but his grave has never been found. Years passed, and Elmer's name faded from the record, swallowed by bureaucratic dust and deliberate silence. But rumors have a way of surviving when truth is buried. In the decades that followed, strange stories began to surface from former hospital employees, nurses who claimed they saw him after the date of his supposed death, wandering the lower halls at night, humming old Appalachian hymns. Others swore they received transfer orders with no destination listed, only a note stamped "Federal Custody." What little evidence escaped the purge paints a picture more disturbing than any urban legend. Unmarked photographs appeared briefly in a 1962 medical journal before being recalled, an article about the genetic and psychological collapse of isolated populations. The face of the unnamed Subject E. He wasn't identified, but the eyes were unmistakable, pale, vacant, eternal. Then, in 1974, a janitor at a decommissioned facility in Kentucky reported finding a room filled with sealed crates. Inside, documents, medical instruments, and film reels labeled with a single phrase, "Hollow Lineage Project." 2 days after filing the report, the facility burned to the ground. Arson. Case never solved. Some believe Elmer never died, that he was taken by the same government that sought to erase him, used for experiments in human heredity, his bloodline mapped, dissected and hidden in laboratories under new names. Others say his body was finally destroyed, along with every trace of what he represented, the living embodiment of what happens when a society abandons its forgotten corners. But the more haunting truth lies not in what happened to Elmer, but in why it was allowed to happen at all. His story wasn't unique. There were others, families scattered through Appalachia, the Ozarks, the Deep South, whole communities slowly collapsing under generations of neglect and shame. America Loam oaked away, called it backwoods folklore, and moved on. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run from it or face what your family became? Because somewhere, deep in the country's forgotten heartlands, there are still houses like the one in the Hollow, still names scratched out of records, still eyes looking out through broken windows, waiting for someone to remember them. In the years that followed, journalists tried to track the whispers. A reporter from Ohio claimed to have found the last surviving cousin of the Hollow family, an old woman who lived alone in a trailer park outside of Beckley. When asked about Elmer, she refused to say his name. She only said this: "He wasn't born, he was repeated." The phrase lingered, chilling in its simplicity. Repeated, like the land itself kept giving birth to the same spirit, reshaped and renamed because no one had the courage to end it. Those who've studied the case now call it genetic recursion, though that term feels too clean, too clinical. What happened in that hollow was not science, it was penance. A human family turned into a mirror that reflected everything America wanted to forget: its poverty, its isolation, its sin. Elmer was not a monster by choice. He was the sum of everyone who refused to look. In the early 2000s, a box of damaged records surfaced during a university archive transfer in Charleston. Among the water-stained papers was a single photograph, nearly dissolved by time. The face, partly obscured, eyes ghostly white, matched descriptions of Elmer Hollow. The photo was dated 1973, 15 years after his supposed death. No one has explained how it exists. Within weeks, the photograph disappeared from the archive catalogue. Those who saw it described something unsettling: the faint outline of another figure standing behind him, hand on his shoulder, features blurred. Some say it was Lila. Others claim it was just an artifact of the film, but the image, they say, felt alive. And then there's the final note, found tucked between the pages of an old medical ledger, unsigned, written in uneven handwriting. They said the bloodline ended, but it doesn't end. It waits. Maybe that's all this story ever was, a warning left for those willing to dig too deep. Maybe Elmer Hollow Is never meant to die because men like him aren't born in a single body. They're born in the places we abandon, in the families we forget, in the corners of a country that still hides its broken children. And maybe that's why no one talks about him anymore. Somewhere out there, beneath the weight of years and shame, the Hollow property still exists. Locals say the land refuses to sell, that surveyors' compasses spin when they try to map it, that cell signals vanish in the valley where the house once stood. The foundation remains, swallowed by ivy and dirt, the wood long gone, but the earth itself feels wrong. Cold, even in summer. Quiet, even when the wind howls. Hunters have come back from that hollow, speaking in half-whispers about voices. A man's voice, they say, calling out softly, not in anger, not in fear, just calling for Mama. One hunter swore he saw movement inside the tree line, a shape with eyes that caught light like an animal's, yet too high off the ground. Another found an old Bible in the mud, swollen with rot, pages stuck together. The only legible verse was from Genesis, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. You can call it superstition if you want, or folklore. That's what the government called it too, when the last Freedom of Information Act request tried to unseal Elmer's medical file. No records found, the letter said, but files don't burn that cleanly, and stories don't fade that easily. Someone, somewhere, made sure that every trace of the Hollow family was erased, every paper, every photograph, every testimony, except for one thing they couldn't erase, the feeling that the Hollow bloodline didn't die. It just went quiet. People in the region still talk about children born with two similar faces, families that move from town to town every few years, changing names but not features, always pale, always watchful. If you ever find yourself driving through southern West Virginia at night, stay clear of the roads that don't appear on your GPS, because in those woods the air feels heavy for a reason. The past doesn't stay buried here. It listens, it breathes, it remembers, and sometimes, if you lay isten closely enough, you might hear it remembering you. Because Elmer Hollow wasn't just a man, he was a mirror, a reflection of the rot that festers when a nation turns its back on its own forgotten blood. And some mirrors, once you look into them, you never look away.